The world order that was built after World War II, the one your parents and grandparents were told would last forever, the one American taxpayers have funded with blood, treasure, and the sacrifice of their sons and daughters across generations, that order is cracking wide open right now, today, in real time, and most Americans are not being told the full truth about what that actually means for them, for their families, and for the future of this country. What you're watching unfold on your screens, what you're hearing in fragments from mainstream media outlets more interested in drama than analysis, is not just political noise. This is a fundamental rearrangement of global power, and every single one of these events, Trump threatening to pull America out of NATO, Canada losing the security guarantee it has leaned on for decades, and Canada standing up to condemn the devastating and illegal Israeli assault on Lebanon, these are not separate stories, they are one story. They are chapters of the same book, and that book is about who runs the world, who pays for it, who bleeds for it, and who finally decides they've had enough. Let me walk you through exactly what's happening and why it matters to every American watching this right now. Let's start with NATO, because that is where the tectonic shift is most visible and most dangerous. President Donald Trump sat down and told the Daily Telegraph, a British newspaper, not an American one, that he is strongly considering pulling the United States out of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He didn't say he was frustrated. He didn't say he was disappointed. He said it was beyond reconsideration. He called NATO a paper tiger. He said, "I was never swayed by NATO. I always knew they were a paper tiger, and Putin knows that too, by the way." Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment. The President of the United States, the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military in human history, just told the world that the alliance that has been the cornerstone of Western collective security since 1949, the alliance that kept Western Europe free from Soviet domination, the alliance that Article 5 built on the promise that an attack on one is an attack on all, that same alliance is, in his view, a fraud. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is a policy signal of the highest order. And the reason Trump reached this point right now is critically important because it doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes directly from the Iran war. When Trump launched what the Pentagon has been calling Operation Epic Fury, his military campaign against Iran, he expected his NATO allies to stand beside him. He expected European nations to send warships into the Strait of Hormuz. He expected the alliance he'd spent years pressuring, the alliance that finally agreed at the 2025 Hague summit to commit to spending 5% of GDP on defense by 2035, to show up when the shooting started, and they didn't. Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer said flatly, "This is not our war." France, Poland, Germany, none of them sent warships. None of them opened their bases to American strike aircraft. And Trump, whatever you think of him personally and politically, is someone who views loyalty as the foundation of every relationship, personal and geopolitical. When he saw his allies sit on their hands while American forces were fighting in the Persian Gulf, he snapped. And the consequences of that snap are now reshaping the entire post-war order. Here's what the media isn't properly explaining to you. Trump cannot legally withdraw from NATO unilaterally. The National Defense Authorization Act of 2023 requires either a two-thirds Senate majority or an act of Congress before any president can formally exit the alliance. So why does his threat still matter? Why is former NATO ambassador Ivo Daalder? Why are analysts across the political spectrum? Why is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe Jim Townsend, a man who knows this institution from the inside, saying we are closer to a break than we have ever been? Because the real power of NATO has never been the treaty text on paper. The real power of NATO has always been the credibility of the American commitment. It has always been the understanding, the bone-deep deterrence level understanding shared by Moscow, by Beijing, by every potential adversary, that if you touch a NATO member, you will face the full weight of American military power in response. The moment Trump says NATO wasn't there when we needed them, and they won't be there if we need them again, in all capital letters on Truth Social, the moment his own ambassador to NATO tells Newsmax that Trump is reevaluating everything, that credibility begins to dissolve. And dissolved credibility in international security doesn't come back quickly. It doesn't come back with a press conference. It comes back, if it comes back at all, over years and decades of demonstrated commitment. The damage is being done right now. And then there's the question of what Trump can do short of formally leaving. Think about this carefully. The United States currently accounts for roughly 60% of all NATO alliance defense spending in 2025. That means the U.S. share of a total NATO budget exceeding $1.4 trillion. There are approximately 84,000 American troops stationed across Europe. The Wall Street Journal has already reported that Trump is actively considering moving American military bases out of countries he views as having been unhelpful during the Iran war. He could withdraw U.S. officers from NATO command structures. He could refuse to share intelligence. He could make it clear, quietly and effectively, that Article 5 is a dead letter as far as this administration is concerned. None of that requires congressional approval. All of it would hollow out the alliance from the inside while leaving the treaty technically intact. Former Italian ambassador to NATO Stefano Stefanini put it precisely: Trump doesn't need to leave NATO to undermine it. By simply saying he might, he has already eroded its credibility, and that erosion is real. NATO's entire value as a deterrent structure rests on the certainty of American commitment. Uncertainty is the enemy of deterrence, and right now, uncertainty is all we have. Now, let's bring Canada into this, because the Canadian piece of this story is one that most Americans completely miss, and that is a serious analytical failure. Canada has existed for the better part of a century inside what analysts have been calling a security discount. Canada spent a tiny fraction of its GDP on defense, hovering around 1.3% for years, well below NATO's 2% target, laughably distant from the 5% benchmark Trump is now demanding, because Canada's geography and its relationship with Washington meant it didn't need to defend itself. Who was going to invade Canada? Nobody, because invading Canada would mean going to war with the United States. That was the deal. That was the unspoken bargain at the heart of the North American partnership, and that bargain is now dead. The Trump administration's November 2025 national security strategy said it explicitly. It embraced what it called flexible realism and acknowledged that the unipolar moment of American predominance is over. It invoked the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, stating that Washington will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. In plain language, what that means for Canada is this: you are no longer a partner with a security umbrella. You are a territory within America's hemispheric sphere of influence, and you are expected to align your economic and defense policies with Washington's priorities or face the consequences. That is not an alliance. That is a vassal relationship. And the Canadians, to their credit, have begun to see it that way. Prime Minister Mark Carney declared publicly that the old relationship between Canada and the United States is over. Canada has been racing to boost its defense spending from 1.4% of GDP to 2%. Canada has been signing security and defense partnerships with European nations. Canada has made 5 multi-day trips to Europe and only 1 brief visit to Washington. Canada is now looking at purchasing European fighter jets rather than American ones because they don't want to be weaponized by their supply dependency on U.S. military equipment. This is not business as usual. This is Canada conducting a strategic pivot in real time under enormous pressure, trying to find a path forward in a world where the security guarantee that underlay its entire foreign policy posture for 75 years has been revoked. Think about what it took to get to this point. Canada and the United States shared what was genuinely, by any objective measure, one of the deepest bilateral friendships in modern history, the longest undefended border in the world. Integrated economies, integrated military command through NORAD, shared intelligence through Five Eyes, aligned values, aligned institutions. That relationship, that genuinely remarkable relationship, is being shredded by a Washington that now views Canada not as a cherished ally, but as a potential strategic asset to be leveraged or a liability to be corrected. The Trump national security strategy talks about ensuring American access to key strategic locations in the hemisphere. Canada's Northwest Passage, which Ottawa has always claimed as internal waters, has never been recognized as such by Washington. And as climate change opens northern sea routes, that dispute is going to become increasingly serious. The Trump administration's language about accessing critical supply chains and materials and critical minerals is a direct reference to Canadian Arctic resources. Canada is sitting on extraordinary mineral wealth that Washington now wants effective control over. The security discount wasn't just free defense. It was the price Americans paid for access and goodwill. And now that price has been withdrawn and the relationship has turned transactional and coercive, and Canada is scrambling to build alternatives. And in the middle of all of this, the NATO crisis, the North American rupture, Lebanon is burning. And Canada has done something remarkable that the American media has largely ignored, which tells you a great deal about who shapes the narrative in this country and why. Canada, just days ago, condemned Israel's assault on Lebanon as an illegal invasion. Prime Minister Mark Carney called it exactly what it is, a violation of Lebanese territorial sovereignty. Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand issued a formal statement saying Canada strongly condemns the airstrikes launched by Israel across Lebanon, including in Beirut, which killed civilians and targeted civilian infrastructure. And this is not a small thing. This is not diplomatic boilerplate. What happened in Lebanon on the 8th of April 2026 was the deadliest single day of violence in Lebanon since the current conflict began on February 28th. Israeli strikes hit over 100 locations within 10 minutes. They hit densely populated residential neighborhoods in Beirut. At least 203 people were killed and hundreds more wounded in a single day. And this happened hours after a ceasefire between the United States and Iran was announced. Iran and Pakistan, who helped broker that deal, both insisted Lebanon was included in the ceasefire. Israel and Washington said it was not. And then Beirut was bombed, and the Strait of Hormuz was closed again. And the entire very fragile ceasefire, as Carney himself called it, began to teeter. What Canada's condemnation represents is something deeper than a diplomatic statement. It represents a values rupture between Ottawa and Washington. Think about the geometry of this moment. Canada is distancing itself from the United States on defense and security. Canada is building closer ties with Europe. Canada is condemning Israeli military actions that Washington is either actively supporting or conspicuously silent about. Canada is calling for a ceasefire that includes Lebanon, in direct contradiction of the American and Israeli position. This is a Canada that is, for the first time in generations, operating with a foreign policy that is genuinely independent from Washington's preferences. And that has enormous implications for how the rest of the world reads the state of American power and American alliances. If your closest neighbor, your nearest partner, the country that shares your longest border and your most intimate economic relationship, if that country is publicly, explicitly on the record disagreeing with your foreign policy and choosing alignment with European positions over American ones, what does that say about the credibility of American leadership? What does it say about the glue that has held the Western alliance together for 80 years? It says the glue is failing. Here's what you need to understand as an American citizen watching all of this unfold. These events are not accidents. They are not random. They are the visible symptoms of a structural transformation in global power that has been building for years and is now accelerating with extraordinary speed. The United States built the post-World War II order. Americans paid for it with their taxes, their soldiers, their global presence. That order was premised on a very specific deal. America would provide security. America would maintain open sea lanes. America would underwrite the rules-based system. And in return, American businesses would have access to global markets. American diplomacy would carry unmatched weight. And American power would be the stabilizing force in an otherwise chaotic world. What is happening right now is the unilateral renegotiation of that deal by an administration that believes the deal was always unfair to Americans. And whether you agree with that position or not, and there are serious arguments to be made about burden sharing and allied free riding, the method of renegotiation matters enormously. You don't renegotiate a foundational security architecture by threatening to walk away from it in all capital letters on a social media platform while your allies are watching Lebanon burn and your ceasefire is collapsing. You don't rebuild American credibility by making NATO allies uncertain about whether Article 5 actually means anything. You don't project strength by having the world watch your closest neighbor choose European fighter jets and European partnerships over American ones. The world is watching. Moscow is watching very carefully. Beijing is watching even more carefully. Every potential adversary of the United States is watching to see whether the alliances that have deterred conflict for 8 decades are real, or whether they are, as Trump himself said, paper tigers. And the tragedy, the real strategic long-term tragedy, is that the answer to that question is becoming less certain by the day. Not because America isn't powerful. America is extraordinarily powerful, but power without credibility is not deterrence. Power without trusted allies is not security. Power without a coherent vision of what you're trying to protect and why is just force without direction. And right now, in this moment, with NATO's future in question, with Canada recalibrating its entire strategic posture away from Washington, and with Lebanon civilians counting their dead while the world argues about whether they were supposed to be covered by a ceasefire. Right now, America is at an inflection point that demands clear eyes, honest analysis, and serious engagement from every citizen who understands what is actually at stake.